So welcome to you all. Andy put the slides up for us, and I'll try and kick off and run through the slides just to do the housekeeping as we need to. So thanks very much. Just to introduce you to the day, bit of introductions from us all, and then I'm going to run into some more of the detail. I'm going to hand off to Richard Andrews, who's going to look at the functions and foundations of the role of Police and Crime Commissioner. Then to Anya, who's going to look at scrutiny and performance. Then Enzo, who's going to look at wider partnerships and criminal justice system. Then also Alan, who's going to look at protecting the vulnerable and victims through commissioning. On to Laura in terms of engaging with the public. And then finally back to me this morning as we look at the Commissioner's role as it supports policing. And then this afternoon, we're going to join the Chief Constable and the Deputy to look at the size and scale of policing in Hampshire. So it's over to me just to introduce you to the size and scale of the role of Police and Crime Commissioner. And some of you will know this very well, but to some of you, you'll find this is either a challenge or a surprise. And so Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton is a big place. Last calculated or published figure says that there are just short of 2 million people that live in Hampshire as a county, and Portsmouth, Southampton and the Isle of Wight as the other three top tier authorities. Nearly 7,000 miles of road, 230 miles of beautiful coastline, 641 schools, plus 59 colleges and 4 universities with over 337,000 students. We have airports, we have ports, we have public airfields, we have private airfields, we have container and passenger ports. We've got 19 parliamentary constituencies, so you've got 19 MPs that you will regularly work with. Now, what 19 MPs and 1 PCC, that in and of itself means that there's an awful lot of communication, a lot of conversation that goes on. We do have a county council and the 3 unitaries, as I've said. We've also got 11 districts and boroughs, 13 community safety partnerships, 4 local safeguarding children boards. The idea is that I want you to get is that Hampshire's a big place. In terms of scale, it's the 5th biggest police force outside of the metropolitan areas, and it's also has as much urban policing as many of the urban forces and as much rural policing as many of the rural police forces. In Hampshire, there are now just sort of 900,000 homes. You have an electorate of up to about 1.2 million voters, so very different in terms of scale to even the MPs, who divide that number down by 19. 2 million residents, as I've said, and within those 2 million residents at the last census, there were 90 different ethnic groups represented. And within those, there are many, many more different religious communities and other communities that we work with as the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, supporting the Commissioner to work into and to work with. And if that wasn't enough, over 40 million people live, work and travel within Hampshire in any given year. And all of those people look to you as the prospective Police and Crime Commissioner, and then you as the elected representative of the Police and Crime Commissioner, to support them in their desire to feel safe and have the right policing services and the right care in terms of their vulnerabilities given to them. So here's a slightly bigger map still. Hampshire as a constabulary and Hampshire as a PCC work directly with Thames Valley. So our primary partner and some of the shared services we deliver for policing work directly with Thames Valley. And so within that grouping, we have 2 million people that we look after, and then there are just over 2 million more above us that we work with. But that isn't the end of the role that you have in terms of Police and Crime Commissioner. So the Police and Crime Commissioner works directly with the Police and Crime Commissioner from Thames Valley in terms of joint policing. And then we have a region as well that includes Surrey, Sussex and Kent. And policing is delivered for our region in the southeast through that grouping of police forces. So there are further relationships that you build with the Surrey, Kent and Sussex PCCs. And if that wasn't broad enough, our Wessex region, where we deliver our criminal justice services, goes the other way. So you have a relationship with Dorset and Wiltshire and the PCCs there in terms of the development of criminal justice and the local criminal justice board and the work that we do into the wider criminal justice system. Because the role isn't just police commissioner, it's police and crime commissioner, and the and crime bit you'll find takes up as much, if not more, of your time as the police bit of the role. We also have a number of CCGs, and I don't know if you know this, but in April that figure will change, that broadly those CCGs come together as one, apart from Portsmouth. And so the picture for our CCGs, working with Maggie McIsaac, who's another person who we work with very closely, is going to change. But on top of that, you've got South Coast Ambulance Service as well as the South Central Ambulance Service. And so what you can see, even from just the emergency services and the work that we do there, alongside Hampshire Fire and Rescue as our fire service, which now includes the Isle of Wight as a single authority going forwards, is something that's considerable in terms of your effort. And so the journey you then go on to think about how to deliver the role as Police and Crime Commissioner brings a number of statutory responsibilities with it. So actually there are over 50 different statutory responsibilities of the role, but what I've tried to do is just highlight the key ones for you this morning. So yes, you'll be aware that as Police and Crime Commission, you'll have the responsibility to set strategic direction for policing, and you do that through the development of your police and crime plan, which you create as you come into office, that you need to consult, particularly with community safety partnerships and their strategic assessments, and also other key partners, and then you review on a regular basis. And that sets the direction for the strategy for policing, and it is the overarching strategy, and it isn't just for policing, it also is for the vulnerable, it also is for victims, because all of these are different statutory responsibilities that you have alongside policing. Within that, you have to set the council tax and to review the policing budget. And now the grant is given to the government each year. And many of you will be aware that Hampshire is one of the highest performing forces, but it's the lowest funded force, that it is 42 million a year underfunded, even from the average amount of money that police forces are given. And so that brings with it tensions of its own. You also have the responsibility to secure grants and additional finance to provide services to reduce crime and support others in terms of vulnerable and the victims that find themselves impacted by crime. You have a responsibility to engage with the public, to make sure that you've brought together all of the different elements of the public and key stakeholders in community safety, the criminal justice and health partners, and also our top tier local authorities, as well as the districts and boroughs, and to ensure that all of those different competing needs and challenges are balanced and joined up. You also work with them to engage with the public and to make sure that we're listening to and hearing both the wants of the public, but also understanding the needs of the public. And I choose those words carefully because they are very, very different. What the public want and what the public need is something that it creates a tension for the whole of each term of a police and crime commissioner. You also have the responsibility to hold the Chief Constable to account for the delivery of policing. Now, when we meet the Chief Constable this afternoon, it'll be an interesting set of discussions that I'm looking forward to, because holding the Chief Constable to account is very different to setting direction. And you as the Police and Crime Commissioner are a corporation sole and responsible for your core area of business. But the Chief Constable is also a corporation sole, and she is solely responsible for the delivery of policing across Hampshire. And so you, supported by us as the scrutiny body for policing, work hard to understand what the Chief Constable is trying to achieve, and to understand then that tension between what the public expects and what the Chief Constable is able to deliver. You as the PCC have responsibility for all of the assets in policing. So you have the responsibility of the administration of the police estate, and that comes with a number of responsibilities because you're the most senior person. You're therefore responsible for all the health and safety and the risk associated with that. And that's one of the things that Hampshire takes very seriously and is a national leader in terms of the provision of solutions that support policing. You also have the responsibility to administer the whole complaints process and also now the reviews process, which is something we'll talk to you more about. Finally, which is a strange one and is also part of the PCC review going forwards, but you have the oversight of Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. Now, currently the PCC doesn't sit on the the authority, but there is a seat waiting for the PCC as they join next time, and you as a PCC, if you're successful in being elected, can choose to sit on the fire authority and be part of that governance process. And finally, the other key service provision statutory responsibility is to reduce crime and to support victims. Now that has a lot to do with prevention, and you are funded separately by the Ministry of Justice for the support of victims, and so a lot of your money comes to you to support policing, but you also have additional monies that come to you to support victims, and also that you have the responsibility to secure additional grants to be able to further extend that work. So you can see that just those statutory responsibilities I've highlighted to you, and they're just a few of the 50, but I do believe they're the key ones, mean that there's an awful lot to do, to think about, and the role has huge reach and huge influence, and that's very much to you as the candidate, and then to you as the successful candidate who becomes the Police and Crime Commissioner, to influence how people across Hampshire are kept safer. So just finishing this section, a day in the life of a Police and Crime Commissioner. These figures are last year's figures, but what you'll see is that there are so many different things, but the scale of the investment the Commissioner currently makes is orders of magnitude different in terms of what you can afford to spend on keeping people safer, as it is which is be nearly £1 million a day that you spend on Hampshire Constabulary. And so it's your choice as to how you balance that up, and how you invest in policing, but also how you invest in the vulnerable, in victims, in prevention of crime rather than detection of crime. And one of the Pelian principles is that policing is to deliver the absence of crime, not the reduction in crime. And so therein lies the challenge to stop crime rather than just to look at how you might detect crime that's happened. And all of that is the responsibility of the Police and Crime Commissioner. We pride ourselves in being a data-enabled organisation that supports the Commissioner, so we provide you a lot of information that helps you understand the context in which you would work as Police and Crime Commissioner, so that you don't just live with information provided through policing, that you have a lot of information to hand that helps you understand the broader picture of policing and all of the criminal justice system, and what's going on across the top tier authorities, and where the challenges are within the communities that you represent. So I'm going to draw my first section to a close there. I'm going to hand straight on to Richard so that you can actually get into some of the stuff around standards and compliance, and do feel free to make sure that you pop the questions in the chat function, so that at the end of Richard's session we can start to pick up some of those. So Richard, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Good morning, everybody, again. As introduced at the beginning, my name is Richard Andrews, Head of Standards and Compliance at the PCC's office. By way of a very brief introduction, I've been with the PCC's office since 2012, and also spent a short period of time with the previous police authority as well. Worked in a variety of different roles within the organisation, but my length of time with the organisation has meant that this will be the third election process that I've been involved with. Next slide, please, Andy. So as the title suggests of this section, my aim is to highlight some of the functions and foundations of the role of the Police and Crime Commissioner. And a significant foundation of the role is the Police and Crime Plan itself. Now, you can see on this slide that it's a statutory responsibility to issue a plan, and irrespective of when the election is going to be held, and I'm sure some of you have heard some noises about that in the last week, the plan has to be produced by the end of the financial year in which the election is held. So as things stand at present, the election's scheduled for May 2021. So the plan has to be published by the end of March 2022. Now, until such a time as a new plan is produced, Chief Constable must have due regard to whatever plan is in place at that time. Next slide, please, Andy. So the plan itself is, in very simple terms, the transformation of a successful candidate's manifesto into a deliverable plan for their term of office. In developing the plan, the OPCC will support a PCC to go through the process that's set out in this slide to ensure that it's a robust plan that takes into account the local and national context, has been considered by a wide range of stakeholders, is informed by data and evidence, and is published by the required deadline, and has an associated delivery plan with it, which is essentially taking the what that's outlined in the plan and turning it into a how document that the PCC staff, led by James as Chief Executive, can deliver upon on behalf of you as PCC and in conjunction with you. Next slide, please. Now, writing and delivering a police and crime plan is just one of the many functions and responsibilities of a PCC, and there is no way that these presentations could ever cover them all. But what I would commend to you all is the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners Candidate Briefing Pack, which is available to download from their website, and I also believe from our own election page as well. In my opinion, it's quite a thorough walkthrough of the role of a police and crime commissioner in very generic terms. But the purpose of this morning is to kind of draw your attention to some Hampshire specific things about how things are done at present and how things have been applied here. I'm not going to talk through the mechanics of the election process itself, the eligibility process, the disqualification criteria, because it is different to the criteria to be a candidate in other elections, or the nomination process, because the OPCC doesn't have a role in that at all. That responsibility falls to the police area returning officer. And for those of you that don't know, that role is performed by Mark Heath, who is the election lead for Southampton City Council and is, I would say, one of the most experienced returning officers in the country. So if you've got any questions in relation to the election process itself, it is in Mark's direction that you should direct those to. The APCC guide does include some advice around manifestos and campaigning, such as around making promises that are impossible to keep because they aren't in the remit of a PCC. And the purpose of today is kind of to draw your attention to some of those areas. Of course, the OPCC is here to serve the PCC of the day, and we'll always do our best to deliver whatever the PCC directs us to do so. But experience does tell us that to set out such things at an early stage makes for a positive and productive working relationship from the outset. Next slide, please, Andy. So Chapter 4 of the APCC guide talks about the PCC's statutory responsibilities, and it refers to it from a legislative perspective. Now, it's my job as Head of Standards and Compliance to ensure that those legislative boxes are ticked, making sure that what a PCC has to do is adequately addressed. But how a PCC achieves that is where a successful candidate will have influence and where you will see around the country the different ways that those things are achieved. Now, the two areas in this chapter that I wanted to highlight, one is around page 9, refers to the police complaint system and the role of the PCC in that. Now, it refers to the review function that all PCCs must perform, but also the additional steps a PCC can put in place to handle initial contact from the public. Now, there are 3 variations that exist around the country, and in Hampshire and the rest of the South East region, the current position is that PCCs are carrying out the review function only, known as Model 1, and are holding the force to account for the way it handles complaints from the public. It's possible to change this. There are pros and cons to it, but I would estimate that developing and implementing a business plan for this would take around 6 months. And there's more about that in the APCC guide in chapter 14 and on page 29 onwards. At the bottom of page 9 of the guide, it refers to the policing protocol, which is a secondary piece of legislation which sets out the boundaries of the relationship between chief constables, PCCs and the police and crime panel. Now, the whole of chapter 5 of the APCC guide is dedicated to this, and it's an important chapter in understanding what a PCC can and cannot do in respect of operational policing matters, and I would encourage you to read that one thoroughly. Finally, on page 10 is a reminder that a PCC is bound by the 7 principles of public life, known as the Nolan Principles, as they're a holder of public office. The successful candidate will be required to sign a code of conduct when they take office, and it is the adherence to this code that will be considered when complaints are made about a PCC to the police and crime panel. For those of you who are familiar with public office, there's nothing unique about the role of a PCC in that respect. And the current code of conduct is available on our website for all to view. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, Chapter 7 of the APCC Guide talks about fire and rescue governance and the current options that are available to PCCs that were introduced in the Policing and Crime Act of 2017. Now, one of the drivers for bringing together the governance of fire and police has been to drive efficiencies and overall savings to the public purse, bringing down the barriers to collaboration that may have existed between public sector partners. Now, fortunately, public services in Hampshire have been on a collaboration journey for nearly 10 years already, and the PCC, the Constabulary, the Fire and Rescue Service and Hampshire County Council have already worked for a number of years in a shared service partnership that covers a number of support services, including finance, HR, procurement and facilities management. So the quick wins for public finances weren't there in Hampshire, as they may have been in other parts of the country. However, there is a duty upon the PCC to consider the option, and having done a feasibility study, the position was reached by the current PCC that it wasn't the right time to develop a full business case and gain government approval for the transfer of fire and rescue governance from the Fire Authority to what would become a Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. However, the position is always kept under review, and as James has already referred to, there is a seat available on the current Fire Authority for a PCC to take that up should they wish to. Now, as is referred to in the APCC guide, this whole area about fire governance is one of the areas of scope of the PCC review that has been carried out by the government over autumn and winter. The outcome of part 1 of that review is due imminently, and it may have an impact on the responsibilities of a PCC going into the next term of office. Once more information is known about this, we will publish something on our election webpage. Next slide, please, Andy. The next 2 slides, they relate to the complaints process and the statutory duties of a PCC within that. The slides are provided in this slide pack more for your information than to talk through in detail now, because it contains additional information to what I talked about earlier and to what is found within the APCC guide. So I'm just going to skip over the next couple. So if you can skip on 2, please, Andy. That's great. Thank you very much. As James already referred to in his introduction, the PCC is not only an elected official, but they are a corporation sole in their own right, an organisation, a separate legal entity. So this slide essentially just covers that and acts as a reminder, because as a separate public sector organisation, we have our own responsibilities that are outlined within the legislation that I've already referred to. The PCC is recognised as a local government body under the Local Government and Housing Act. The Chief Executive, James, is a head of paid service and a monitoring officer in the same way as a local authority has that role. The PCC is also a data controller. They're registered with the Information Commissioner's Office as a separate data controller to Hampshire Constabulary. We have our own records that we have to manage in line with the Data Protection Act and GDPR. The PCC is a separate body within the police complaints system as well. So the PCC is the appropriate authority for complaints against the Chief Constable. It's also the local review and oversight body for the broader police complaint system. There are also functions that have to be administered in relation to police appeals tribunals and the management of legally qualified chairs and independent members who sit on gross misconduct hearings for police officers. And the other thing to say is that as a separate body, a PCC is also accountable to many other organisations and regulators. Some of them include the Police and Crime Panel, a Joint Audit Committee, external auditors, the Cabinet Office and the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, and also to independent inquiries, and also finally to the Pensions Regulator. Thank you, Andy. Next slide, please. The final couple of slides in my section relate to the budgetary process, which you can see from the first slide is another of those statutory functions of a PCC. Next slide, please, Andy. We haven't got enough time to go into the detail of it today, and in fact it's probably the wrong time to talk about the detail now, because the 2021-22 budget is being worked on as we speak in preparation for delivery to the Police and Crime Panel at the end of this month. What I would say is that I'd encourage you to read the detail of the papers that will be going to the Police and Crime Panel when they are published in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. However, what I wanted to do was to highlight the process that a PCC will be involved in when it comes to the budget and precept setting. Now, this chart could be presented in a number of ways. Some of these things take place on a constant annual basis. Some things just crop up as we get close to the budget decision-making time. But the financial scenario planning that takes place between a PCC and the officers of the OPCC and Hampshire Constabulary is something that occurs on a quarterly basis, but really comes into full swing in kind of the autumn time, September, October time, in anticipation of the government funding settlement being announced in December or January. That's something that's dictated to by the Treasury, and we, like other public bodies around the country, sit and wait ahead of Christmas to find out what that funding settlement is going to be. From that, plans have to be made and precept recommendations have to be developed and put towards the Police and Crime Panel, which takes place in January, in time for a budget to be signed off in February, ready for it to take effect at the beginning of April. Now, there are many financial processes that take place throughout the year. There is annual and quarterly reporting. There are annual accounts that have to be presented to internal and external auditors. But the important point to make at point 3 is of this slide is that actually there is a year-long consultation and stakeholder engagement process that takes place around the precept level and the budget as a whole. James has touched on already the situation that we find ourselves here in Hampshire about budget levels. So in effect, our backs are always against the wall when it comes to budget setting. And the setting of the precept and council tax levels is an emotive subject from a public's perspective. So we want to ensure through our consultation and engagement process, which you will hear about later from my colleague Laura, that we get a range of views from the public throughout the year, not just a critical time when we are setting a budget. And a lot of the detail of that will go into our report that we present to the Police and Crime Panel at the end of this month.
Good morning. My background is a bit different from Richard's, so I'll just give you a quick introduction to myself. I've been with the office since 2017, and previous to that I worked for the Gambling Commission, and before that I worked for the Metropolitan Police as intelligence analyst and a higher intelligence analyst. So my time away from policing gave me kind of that steer to come back into it, but from a very different perspective. The office is much broader, as has been described earlier, than just policing. It is the beyond policing crime, working with victims, procuring services. So you'll hear more about that later today. And the work that my team do support the other teams in understanding evidence, understanding communities, and looking at the needs and the what works of what we commission. But the piece that I really want to talk to you about today is around scrutiny. So if I could have the next slide, I can start to unpack the order of where the police and crime plan sits, what that means for police, what that means for us in the office. Scrutiny of the Chief Constable is one of the statutory duties that the Police and Crime Commissioner has. And there are various ways that that can be delivered, but it must represent the public voice in that scrutiny. So if you look across other offices, you will find different formats. There is some flexibility in the way it's delivered, but ultimately we have to be able to respond to the public around what that scrutiny looks like and the responses that we are getting. So one of our key mechanisms is the one-to-one between the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner. And that happens on a regular basis and allows conversations at a greater level of detail than what we might see with the public, but it goes on then to inform the kind of questions that we might ask in public as well. We run something called Compass, so that's the Commissioner's Performance, Accountability, Scrutiny and Strategy meeting. And that runs every couple of months and can take a different theme. So they're all live, they're all recorded. You can go back and have a look at previous meetings. The meetings will be informed by some of the events that have happened in recent months. So it may be that there is something, for example, the response to COVID is something that's very, very current. We wouldn't necessarily have seen it coming, but questions around how police are dealing with that and managing it can present themselves through the Compass meetings. We can also take thematic views that are programmed, so we know what we're working towards during the course of the year, dependent on seasonality of crime. For example, when we come up to autumn time, we tend to see increase in violent crime, and so we would know to be prepared for the kind of questions and lessons learned from the year before. We also ensure that we include the public voice when we're running Compass. So public voice is drawn from a number of different projects that we have in the office, but most accessibly, we always publish an opportunity for the public to present their questions to us ahead of Compass. And that's becoming an increasingly popular avenue now. So the last one that we had over 50 questions come in from the public, and that's in addition to lots of extra work that we do around surveys, focus groups, trying to understand changes in responses that we see. So we track themes, and we run lots of different types of service that explain to us whether people have confidence in policing, whether they trust their local police, whether they think police communicate well. And we're able to look at that from the basis of what gender the person is, what age group they are, what ethnicity they are. So we can very quickly respond to any perceived changes. Sometimes we are working with small numbers, and that's the reason that we go out to speak to targeted communities on occasion. And we have a programme and a strategy that dictates what we plan to do across the course of the year. But again, that's flexible. If there are things that appear in the media, for example, that we think might impact confidence, we will rearrange our focus and go out and ask questions on those topics. We also attend a number of different meetings. Various boards can include just ourselves and police, or they can include partners as well. And you'll have heard already this morning, there are a large number of partners out there. But for the purpose of scrutiny, our key focus is generally the community safety partnerships. The community safety partnership is a national obligation. So they're very similar across the country, and they include fire and rescue, housing, probation, and health. And from their experience and from the analysis that they do, we understand much more about need beyond policing in communities. And of course, they each have an impact on one another. So when we come to various boards, we are able to use the evidence that we have gathered through the various projects that we have on, from the feedback from communities, from speaking to victims directly or through the schemes that we fund, through professionals that are able to tell us about what the risk is. And again, this is a really clear time of change where we wouldn't expect things like access to Wi-Fi to necessarily be a problem, just as an example of something that our partners might come back and tell us about that is then relevant for us to talk about with policing, about what barriers are for victims to be able to report their crimes, and maybe to be able to separate themselves from a situation where they're in close proximity to an offender. So we can get into real detail, but get a much more broad view of the impact of crime through our partnerships. And that's very much where our evidence and analysis focuses. To support that, we also have a big data system that's been running for 3 years now, and it collates information that's used for strategic assessments. Strategic assessments are mandated. Every community safety partnership must write one, and they used to be much more consistent, and over time they've become less consistent. So the purpose of us providing a database where they all access information that was downloaded at the same time, it covers the same topics, but is as broad as we could possibly make it, means that they're able to write very consistent assessments, and we gather those in the office to review them, to understand what changes in trends are, and to be able to ask really specific questions when we're looking at the impact of policing, areas of risk, things that our partners are telling us are changing, and to help us prepare better for the future. So all of this eventually makes its way back up to the police and crime plan, and to deliver that police and crime plan, the police have their 6 areas of focus, which they engage with us around to quite a detailed level. So we're able to attend meetings and ask questions about specific metrics that help them to deliver their plan and to understand the impact that it has on delivery of the police and crime plan. And within the office, we also have our own delivery plan. And again, there are metrics that sit beneath that we're able to measure to monitor progress, and to be able to have really productive conversations with policing around what we need to improve on and how we work better together to get the outcomes. But at the end of it all, we do come back to this point of scrutiny. So as much as we're able to provide things from the offset, we're not looking to jump up with surprises. We're looking to demonstrate things that we're worried about as soon as we know about them, and to get the best outcome from the public to enable the police to deliver the best that they can. But at the end of it, we need to ask those questions about how it's being delivered, what the impact is, what the decisions have been that sit behind it that make to make it clear to the public about how complex some of these decisions are. They're not straightforward. Yes, we would like to be able to provide more for one community, but what drives that decision and how are they ensuring that they're getting the very best outcome for the public? Could I have the next slide, please? So this here is the police's plan on a page, and this is very much the guidance that we have to tuck into the metrics that sit beneath it. It looks fairly detailed already on this plan, but there is an awful lot more that sits underneath that we're able to work through, primarily at a meeting called Force Performance Group. And that's a strategic meeting, but it brings to the table the lead officers for each of the areas that we're looking at here. And there is a core structure to the meeting, so it's 3 hours every month, and they will go through in great detail the stable core metrics, look for any changes, any risk areas. They'll be thinking about things like the resource that they have available, and how they're going to manage that. And this is the chance for lead officers to demonstrate all of the work that they've been doing over the course of the month, to respond to any problems that have been highlighted. The meeting also includes things like deep dives. So particularly if there has been something that's presented through the media, or there is something that is a known risk or a high profile crime, they're able to really explore the ins and the outs of how that's been managed. And the same is true for if there are concerns about the outcomes, the outcome rate. So this is where there might be a set number of crimes that take place, but actually you need to get a conclusion on a percentage of those. And if there are any concerns about the outcomes that there are for victims, then that's something that might provide a deep dive thematic session. So it allows all of the right people to be present, to be able to respond to questions, and the relationship is such that we can continue working beyond the meeting. So although it is strategic, if we have further questions as an office, we can work directly with the lead officers, we can work through the boards, and depending on what the work is that we're looking at, it might be something that we need to bring some of our teams together on. That's less common, but it is an option that's available to us because ultimately we are both trying to find the best outcomes for the public. So the police and crime plan is a crucial tool in ensuring that this is steered in the correct way, that the public are able to understand why the direction's been set the way that it has. But there is also the National Police Chiefs Council Policing Vision, and this is much more strategic because it is a nationally set vision, and it includes things like the infrastructure that supports policing, the information technology behind it, the things that police need to be able to do their job. So there are several plans around. This is the one that is of importance to the office. This is the one that we have to demonstrate to the public that we are progressing, that police are delivering to, but it doesn't stand alone. And so there are other responsibilities that the police have to meet. There is also the HMIC, that's Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and Fire and Rescue. So that changed in recent years. It didn't used to be Fire and Rescue. And they go in and hold inspections at a much more operational level. So they will go in several times a year, and they will look at very specific questions about how information is stored, what questions police ask, what the response is from victims. And that very detailed level that they work at allows us to review the reports that they produce and to go back and ask further questions. The standard reports are legitimacy, effectiveness, and efficiency. But beyond that, they also run lots of thematic ones. So they'll select a number of forces during the course of a year to go in and do something which might consider the impacts on older people, how older people are being managed when they report crime, how fraud is being managed, how children are being dealt with by police. And from the outcomes that they have of their thematic sessions, we are able to reflect from the recommendations and go back and ask our own constabulary, whether or not they are adhering to those recommendations, what changes they're making as a result of them, and also understanding how their priority structure accommodates some of the risk factors that have been identified. When we talk about the police priorities, they do have their 6 areas of focus, which I'll show you just in a little bit more detail in a moment. But they are also what might be described as our high harm force. And these are some of the decisions that police forces all over the country are having to make. Are they a force that is going to tackle primarily volume crime, which is how policing is often seen by the public? And if they do, what is the sacrifice? So high harm crime is the real serious level, sexual offences, very serious violence, and the level of investigation that sits behind that is incredibly time consuming. So they have to make decisions about who's been placed, what staff are trained in, what level they're trained in, and how much of the high harm crime gets dealt with. So that's one of the things that we routinely revisit to understand what changes have been made around high level crime. It's been described earlier today as hidden crime, and that's also a problem for us to get our heads around in the office, because hidden crime isn't often reported. It's the stuff that's really difficult to get into, and when you do get a report about it, it's difficult then to keep the victim engaged. And so all of our services come into play, and you'll hear much more about commission services later, but ensuring that victims are able to have the support, to feel comfortable, to feel safe, it all plays into getting better outcomes for victims and for the public. So that's an overview of what the plan looks like. But if we go on to the next slide, you'll just be able to see some of the top line. What does this actually mean? For all the detail, this is what it breaks down to. So within all of the things around identifying and protecting and dealing with the crime itself, the police force also has to be strong enough for the officers to give their very best. And so looking after their people is very, very important to ensure the well-being of their staff. And I think this year has really well demonstrated the efforts that have gone into looking after people. So the impact of COVID on policing could have been much worse than what we have seen, but we did see huge resilience from Hampshire at the beginning of this year. It's still something that must be monitored and tracked all the time to ensure that the police are able to deliver, because if if officers do become sick, if the pressure of the stress of dealing consistently with high harm crime day in, day out becomes too much, the workforce is weakened and they are less able to deliver to the public. So this is an integral part of their performance measure. Being ethical and inclusive of all, there are strategies that sit behind each of these that go into much greater detail about how they intend to achieve these things and what achieving it actually means. So here you just get that very high level what they're aiming for, but there is so much more that sits behind it, and each leader brings something of their own to it around the direction they're going to take and helps to shape those strategies. Most of these speak for themselves as they present on a page. So the building partnerships is very much what we do as well. And that's one of the areas that we're more likely to come together on the day-to-day work that we do, and then return to that scrutiny on a regular basis. And this really just contextualizes where the boards sit. So we have some of our own boards. We also have our own scrutiny panels. For example, I chair the out of court disposal panel, and that's where somebody has reported a crime, but from the victim's perspective, they might not actually want to see an arrest as a result of it, or that might not be the best outcome, where it's something that wouldn't necessarily make it through courts. And yet there can be some very effective interventions, and they will be communicated as a community resolution, which means that advice and guidance is given to a point where both parties are satisfied. Or it can be a conditional caution. So the person that has committed the offence still has to deliver on something that they've been told to do. And failing that, there would be further action. And that gives the opportunity for our services to be introduced. So it may be that somebody is referred to be given help and to be able to deal with anger management, for example. Drugs is something that there are things that people can be helped with without the victim necessarily wanting them to go through the court process. So it's very much about what the victim wants to see happen. They want police to attend, they want somebody to intervene, but it may be, for example, the father of their children. They don't want them to go to court, they just want that thing to stop at that moment in time, and they don't expect it to happen again. Therefore, an out of court might be the right option. But of course, you can hear through the things that I'm saying that there are probably lots of questions around, is this the right thing to do? And that's why we hold a scrutiny panel. So we'll assess between us. I chair it, so I don't influence it, but we have magistrates on there, we have CPS, we have our own volunteers take part in that meeting so that they can each, through their own perspective, challenge the out of court disposals that have been presented. And so there are many boards, some of ours, some of the police, and through the Force Performance Group, we are able to hear back from lead officers around how they are delivering to their plan. The Chief Constable then, with all of that information and with her direction back down to her Constabulary, is able to have conversations with the Police and Crime Commissioner through the one-to-ones, through Compass, and that then feeds back into our plan delivery. And I see there have been lots of questions popping up, so just have a quick look through any unanswered questions. Okay, one-to-ones at the moment, they are scheduled every month. If something forces that date to be moved, there is some flexibility because it's completely arranged between the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner. But there is more communication than the one-to-ones during the course of the month. But that is the kind of standard opportunity to ask those questions.
So let me just amend that slightly.
Sorry,
There's a rhythm and a routine to what the PCC does with the Chief Constable. They meet every week to discuss emerging issues in the week. They meet every month to discuss things that have gone on through the month, and then they regularly meet. And the Compass is the formal public side of what they do. But there's an awful lot that the PCC has to do with the Chief Constable in terms of just understanding the business of policing and bringing to the Chief Constable's attention concerns that have been raised through the PCC, which he does privately, because they're quite robust conversations and not conversations that are generally had in public. The PCC's responsibility, along with the Chief Constable, to ensure that the public continue to have confidence in policing and remain safe is absolutely essential. And so some of the behind the closed door conversations, as you can imagine, can be quite robust and quite challenging, but it's necessary so that the public view that the PCC receives every day from different members of the public is raised, and the concerns are raised with the Chief Constable. And as I hand over to my deputy Enzo's going to take us into much more of the detail around wider partnerships and the crime part of being a police and crime commissioner, which is a lot to do with how we go on to work with a considerable number of partners across the whole of the criminal justice system. So Enzo, happy to hand over to you for this next half-hour session.
Thank you, James. And just to add to that, part of my role is, as well as looking into the criminal justice world for the commissioner, is also to engage with the wider partnership piece, and that's my next couple of slides will just take us through that. By way of introduction on me, I have a criminal justice background, worked in a number of courts, local courts in Hampshire, as well as courts in London and Manchester, and also spent some time working for the Ministry of Justice, and as a senior operations lead for the court service, again, across Hampshire and the Southwest. So I bring all that experience, partnership working and relationships to the role I do as Deputy Chief Executive, and for the current Commissioner, Michael Lane. Andy, could you move to the next slide, and I'll begin to talk through some of the relationships. Thank you. As with the other slides that you saw from Richard, James and Anya, the basis of this is pitched within legislation. So there's a responsibility within the role to engage with criminal justice agencies and ensure that the system's as efficient as it can be. And I picked the very pictorial view of the system to help me talk through the relationships. Clearly, I know the audience listening to this that has great experience of how the system operates. And so I won't go into detail about the ins and outs of it, but I do want to focus on some particular aspects of what the Commissioner brings to this space. One of the key things for me, and one of the key things I think for many police and crime commissioners, is that they act as the victim's voice in this arena. When you look at the flow chart, the system's made up of big agencies, whether they're driven centrally, such as the court service and the CPS, or whether they're driven locally, like the youth offending team or the probation service. But within each of those agencies is the responsibility to kind of consider the victim within the way those agencies operate and interlink. But for a commissioner, I think it's a real responsibility to present that to those agencies and challenge how they behave and how they come together to ensure that the system's efficient as it can be. And the victim voice is one that should be loud from a commissioner's perspective, and it's one that we as an office, through the different work that we do, help to bring that voice to a commissioner so they can have the evidence base, they can have the interaction, they can have the case studies about how the system is impacting on real people's lives. So it's a key aspect of kind of the unique role a commissioner has. And the other uniqueness of a commissioner's role within the CJS is that they have a whole system view of what's going on. You kind of look down on this flow chart and you're able to understand where are the pinch points, where are the failures, and where's the need for improvement. And you have the discussions with the senior leads, whether it's the Chief County Prosecutor, Joe Jakomek at the CPS, whether it's the Court Service Lead, Wendy Waterman, whether it's the National Probation Service Director, Gabriel, whether it's Jim Bork at the prison. They're the relationships that a commissioner has, and they're the relationships that kind of drive the efficiency of the Hampshire system. So the outcome for the public is the best it can be. So as we look through the process, you'll hear from Alan later about where we are able to fund and where a commissioner is able to put their whether it's national funding, as James said, for victim services, or whether it's local funding in terms of out-of-court disposal that you've heard from in terms of Anya. And it's all around the added value that a commissioner brings, and it's the way a commissioner draws those partners together to make the system the best it can be. Now, clearly, if you've experience of how the criminal justice system operates, it can be very frustrating, and that if only partner A and partner B kind of got together, why couldn't they solve their issues? And we found that with the oversight that the commissioner gives the system, that's been happening within Hampshire, and the response to COVID was one of the key things really that showed this. There's been a great coming together of the agencies with the Constabulary and with us to drive changes within the way the courts have operated. And it's a success story really in terms of how Hampshire's coped with COVID and moved from a position where from the first lockdown there was a suspension of how cases were moving through the system to currently where more cases within the magistrates' courts are being dealt with than are coming into the system, and the backlog slowly being eroded. And when the feedback I get from the court service and from Wendy Waterman as the courts lead is that as a region we're one of the best performing in terms of COVID recovery. So it gives us a lot of confidence that the partnership and the relationships that we've helped establish are functioning well. The other aspects of this slide before I move on is really about how a commissioner plays into the relationship. The Local Criminal Justice Board is the organisation that where these organisations traditionally come together on a bi-monthly meeting, and that's where there's the official platform to hold the group to account, and that's where the challenge comes in terms of performance, and that's where the challenge comes in terms of victim voice, and that's where the challenge comes in terms of another important aspect of this, which is about looking to reduce reoffending, because that's one of the pieces that fits into this puzzle, is how a commissioner uses its influence and funding to change people's lives around. Because as you know, if you've been working within the system, or you're interested in the way offenders and the statistics show that there's a huge number of offenders reoffend. And it's about how do you interrupt that cycle of offending? How do you stop seeing the same faces and the same names coming into the court system? And so it's important investment that's put forward, because if you get that investment right, you remove someone's from that offending cycle, you reduce the number of victims. And that ultimately is the goal, stop people becoming victims. James mentioned at the beginning around the prevention piece being an important aspect of how a commissioner moves their role forward, and that for us is an area that we're looking to grow and develop in. And again, you've heard some from Anya in terms of that, and you'll hear a little bit more from Alan in terms of that. Andy, could you just move us on to the next slide, please? So here I've just kind of emphasised some of the partnerships that we do engage with and the commissioner engages with, and I've broken it down into some very broad categories. Now, not to steal any of Alan's thunder, there's a whole range of commissioning partnerships, that we collaborate with other organisations in terms of developing the best offer possible for the public. And here's some of the areas that we're focusing on. There's the whole youth diversion piece, that classic attempt to keep young people away from making the wrong choices so that they can lead productive lives, they can move forward, they can feel part of society. And youth diversion is a huge part that we collaborate with. We work with the youth offending teams so that individuals that are caught up in offending can receive the help they need so that they can make the right choices. And then we work with organisations that take people away from that path so that they don't escalate their offending from low level to more serious. Other aspects of that partnership work is modern slavery, a very key topic and a very live issue really, in how people are being trafficked, and how this is very much one of those hidden harm aspects that you heard James talk about and Anya talk about. And we've got a great partnership where we've brought third sector agencies together, faith areas, community areas, to try to help us dig into this and get help to people that need it, who may not trust the Constabulary or may not trust government agencies. I'll pick another area from this commissioning group, domestic abuse, huge area for us to work with our partners, and we're across the whole Hampshire area. We're working with the top tier authorities to create a very consistent offer, moving away from kind of sometimes the postcode lottery of where you live is what kind of service you get. So that's one of the things that we've had as a theme over the past few years, about how the Commissioner drives that consistency working with the top tier authorities, and we're getting very good progress on that. Still much to do, because as you know, domestic abuse is a huge issue, and it's always a focus for attention in terms of criminal justice. Then we have the multi-agency, and here's some of the partnership working. I've mentioned the Criminal Justice Board, where all the partners that service the court system come together, and you as a commissioner are a key player within that. And then there's the Reducing Reoffending group that comes from that, which through the Commissioner I chair, and that's how we hold the National Probation Service, Community Rehabilitation Company and other agencies. They're responsible for helping offenders turn their lives around, enact that. We also draw in at that point the local prison. Winchester Prison is our main prison that we work with, and it's understanding what offenders coming out of prison need from the community so that they can go in and they don't make that choice that so many do to return to offending because they don't find that there's the support mechanisms or the chance of employment or housing, etc., that they need. So that's a key part of work again, because the aim is to always reduce future victims. Another key part of this multi-agency partnership work is the violence reduction units. And as you know, the government have been keen for areas that have high levels of violence to act locally to reduce those levels and to get under the skin of why such offences are being committed. And Hampshire is one of the 18 areas that has the funding to enable violence reduction units to be put in place. And we have across the Hampshire, we've one in Portsmouth, one in Southampton, one on the Isle of Wight, and one across the rest of Hampshire. And the organisation OPCC, through the Commissioner, plays a key role in how those violence reduction units operate and how they collaborate with the Constabulary, but also with community groups. And again, a key driver in all that is how do you draw young people away from that type of offending? Because whether you're a victim or a perpetrator, within some gang cultures, you're both. One minute you're committing a crime, the next minute a crime is being committed against you. So it's a complicated area that we're leading the way, and we've had some excellent feedback from the Home Office about how our local violence reduction units are operating. The final part is around broader collaboration. Now, James mentioned the relationship in his map of Hampshire and the southeast, etc., of where the relationships are. And it's important to kind of emphasise that within a criminal justice sphere, we work across Wessex, which is with Dorset and with Wiltshire, and we've been collaborating with those two other Police and Crime Commissioner areas in terms of the COVID recovery. And we've been working with them in terms of how we manage victims and witnesses through the delays that have been caused by COVID, so that we have a very strong single offer for the public, regardless of where you live, if you're being serviced by that single criminal justice area. And other collaborations that we have also take us beyond our borders. So we have been working with Avon and Somerset Constabulary and West Midlands Constabulary on hate crime initiatives. Again, a very key part of what we do and how we engage with the public. And you heard from Anya before around how we hear the voice of young people, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from Laura. And one of the issues that young people raise with us is around how hate crime needs to be tackled. And so we're working with those other forces to establish a new way of dealing with that for cases that may not make the threshold to go to court, but still need to be dealt with as part of the out of court disposal. We're working, as I said, with Dorset and Wiltshire in terms of COVID recovery, but we're also working with Dorset and Wiltshire on improving how rape prosecutions are managed by the Crown Prosecution and those two forces and our own force in Hampshire, because it's one of the areas that nationally there needs to be an improvement, and that national issue is also a local issue. So that's another spotlight for us as an office, and a spotlight for you as a commissioner on how those agencies responsible for managing those cases do so, whether it's initial investigation, Crown prosecution, decisions over charging or not, and then also how that is managed by witness care units going into court, and how the individual is kept safe and engaged with the process. So that's a key piece of work that we're undertaking. And then another connection that we have, again, with broader collaboration, is we're working with the Home Office and Southampton Safer City Partnership and a large number of stakeholders to embed a project to improve areas in Southampton City, so that again we kind of design out crime, and again it's that reduction of victims as part of the work of the Commissioner in his or hers beyond crime role. Andy, can you move us on to the final slide, and then I'll just check the chat for questions. So one of the things to look ahead for is, you know, James mentioned and Richard mentioned about the review of Police and Crime Commissioner roles. And one of the areas that you may want to expand into is the relationship with health. We've already done that, and there's a relationship with our local commissioning partner from health in terms of how we kind of join forces so we can address issues around drug and alcohol addiction. But one of the other areas to think through about is how the needs of the public, and this BBC data just emphasises that, around how issues around mental health impact on policing, because policing is naturally drawn into those crisis situations, but actually it takes away the resource from what you could imagine is the kind of standard policing behaviour of investigating crime and stopping antisocial behaviour. And so the issue of the relationship with public health and health issues is one that, as a commissioner, you may want to add into the development of your plan, because it's a new area, but we feel is an area that could be very fruitful in terms of managing police resource correctly, but also highlighting where the needs for individuals that are showing, for example, in the slide, mental health needs should be properly addressed. Now, we're very lucky within the local criminal justice system that we have the engagement of senior public health officials. And so these conversations are beginning to happen and changes are beginning to take place. But it's something I wanted to flag so that, you know, as you consider how you put together your portfolio of ideas, that it may be one that kind of fits within that.
I'm going to hand over to Alan Hagger, who's our head of commissioning, for the next, and this is as much as criminal justice and the work that Enzo does with you as Commissioner, looking at all of those partners. And I don't think we listed all the different partners there are, but significant number, significant opportunity. There are as many again, and then many more in terms of the work that we do with partners to deliver commissioning. And Alan often says to me, James, there are some things that only a commissioner can do. And for me, that's right at the heart of what we do with commissioning. There are some things that only the commissioner can do. The consistency of service, the breadth of service, making sure that that service provision is the same on the Isle of Wight as it is in Rushmore, as it is in Southampton, as it is in Portsmouth, as it is in Andover, as it is in Havant, and keep going to make sure that every person has the same level of service, no matter where they are across the whole of the Hampshire policing area, has been sort of certainly a work of the ages for Alan, because that's Alan puts most of his effort into trying to change the commissioning landscape. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you, James. Firstly, some very interesting questions from the last session. I'll help Enzo, but 36% of people coming out of Winchester Prison have no fixed abode, and that is a direct lead into what we know will actually be an increased rate of reoffending. This afternoon, I've got a webinar with the Home Office around looking at additional funding around people leaving the prisons. And we're looking at working jointly with Jane Smith from One Small Thing, which was the organisation that Enzo mentioned, working in Southampton with female offenders. So that's something that's quite exciting that's going on at the moment. So firstly, who I am, I'm Alan Hagger. I'm Head of Commissioning. I've been commissioning services for a long time. My background is actually in social care, in learning disabilities, although I went on to commission services in housing, the armed forces, health, physical disability, older people, and now crime and disorder. So I've had I'm a commissioner, and I've been doing it for a number of times over a number of different areas. Andy, can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Right, so this provides the legislative background for the bit that we do, and it basically what this does is it focuses us on the two areas of work. It is about services to secure crime and disorder reduction, which means largely working with offenders. And the second bit is around supporting victims and witnesses. So when the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office was originally set up, it took responsibility for a number of grants. That was then, which came from something called the Safer Communities Fund. That was then augmented by all of the funding that came to the Police and Crime Commissioner for support to victim services. Previously had all gone to an organisation called Victim Support. We still contract with Victim Support here, but all of those victim support services then came to the Police and Crime Commissioner. And since then, a number of other areas of funding from central government have been devolved to the Police and Crime Commissioner, working with victims, working with offenders, which makes up the budget that we now hold, recognising the increasing and still to be increased role of the Police and Crime Commissioner in this area of commissioning work. So if we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Andy. Right, focusing on commissioning, preventing crime and supporting victims, as I have said, reducing reoffending, as came up from the last question. We can talk about preventing crime in terms of working with young people to support them to not get involved in the criminal justice system in the first place, but also once people are involved in the criminal justice system, how we can support people to not continue in it and provide other opportunities as well. What this does is it reduces demand on policing. It means that which is hugely important, and absolutely everything we do is through partnerships. Even when we commission services on our own, which is unusual, the Victim Care Service, Restorative Justice being two examples of that. But even where we do the commissioning and the procurement on our own, it is built into a network of support and other services that provided by statutory and voluntary agencies with all of our partners. In terms of supporting victims, that is in itself a very, and as I think as Enzo also said, a very wide range of people are involved in that, which I'll mention as we go through. But certainly we have the generic victim services, and then increasingly specialist services come from that around domestic abuse, sexual crime, stalking, modern slavery, and so on and so forth. So if we move on to the next slide, Andy. Right. Why is this an important part of the PCC role? Because I think, as James was just saying, we ensure consistent targeted levels of services across the policing area. And actually, you could write a book about that, number one, because consistency is one thing, but what we're not talking about is the same thing everywhere, the same level to people, but we've also got to recognise that we live in a very diverse county. The issues in Portsmouth or Southampton are different to the issues in Hart. And we have to recognise that and make sure that the services are both tailored and targeted at the same time as the people who are experiencing particular needs get a consistent approach from the services available. That is a complex, it is more of an art than a science doing that, and it involves a range of partnerships with the 4 top-tier authorities, but also with the 11 districts and boroughs in Hampshire. The next one is maximising investment and ensuring financial stability. I will come on to the money bit in a minute. We work with a whole range of people. We apply for funding. We look to ensure that the funding that we do get and that others, our partners, get is targeted as effectively as possible at the evidence that we have around need and effectiveness. Financial stability is very difficult to maintain. It is difficult because a lot of the funding we get is around annual settlements, annual opportunities, but that is a major part of the role that we play. Understanding the needs of the community and the supply of support available. This is at the heart of, if you wanted a definition of what commissioning is, I would say commissioning is around demand and supply, and we manage the supply of support. The demand we understand through understanding the needs of our community, and the incredible work of Anya and Interact and the performance team, but also of the partner agencies, the intelligence we get from partner agencies, so that we understand the needs of our community, and also then we can organise with our partners the supply of support available. One of the things about commissioning that becomes apparent is that there are things that are best commissioned at a national level, things that are best commissioned at a pan-Hampshire level, and things that are best commissioned at a local level. And it is that understanding with our partners which means that we can properly understand the needs of the community and make sure that the supply is properly targeted. Do we look for solutions where gaps are identified in service provision? And that's something that we haven't got the answers to. Everyone's problems we don't know. I'm not an expert in many of the areas that we commission services for, but we know who those experts are and we know the people who know, and it's about harnessing their knowledge and intelligence. And finally, supporting and nurturing our providers. The providers, mainly voluntary organisations, they are the people that we depend upon to provide reliable services, to reliable, high quality services. We need to make sure that they are sustainable in themselves, that they are supported, never ever more so than in the last year when we've been in regular contact with people through COVID, to make sure that we've still got a thriving voluntary sector group of providers able to provide now, but also at the end of the pandemic. So next slide, Andy. And this is where we receive money from. There's many different sources. We spend about 7.3 million a year. Of that, we get 2.43 million from the Victims Fund from the Ministry of Justice. The sexual abuse counselling is money that we applied for. And that was money that with sexual abuse services, some of it was devolved to the Police and Crime Commissioner and an element was kept at the Ministry of Justice. With that, what they wanted to do was to look at the impact of devolving that funding to police and crime commissioners, and we were one of the areas chosen to pilot that. So we have that funding that's come down as well. As James has already mentioned, and I think Enzo has already mentioned, we have received 880,000, and I think we may be getting slightly more as well for the violence reduction unit, which is a very interesting and very important piece of work. And we have 1.74 million from the Police and Crime Commissioner's budget, which comes before any other activity. So the amount that we get from the police grant is probably about 23% odd of what we actually spend in every year. Well, actually, when I say in every year, well, that figure will change. That figure includes money that came from COVID relief fund from central government and other money that we've received, for instance, around domestic abuse perpetrators from the Ministry of Justice. So we get different amounts of money in, and that will vary year on year. But what we have seen is, generally speaking, that money grows as more and more responsibilities are handed to the Police and Crime Commissioner. Next slide, please, Andy. Right, we work through grants and we work through contracts. And when we started, as I mentioned earlier, everything was through grants, and we've moved more and more and more to contracts. And they both have a place, in my view, where we have essential core services, generally speaking, larger services, unlikely to change substantially in the short term. Then the best way of maintaining stability and giving certainty to the provider so that they can grow and develop is through longer term contracts. When we're looking at more small scale, more local, more voluntary, more pilot, maybe pilot services where we're trying things out, where we can apply research, then we go through a grants program. All of those, whether they're contracts or grants, are managed in partnership with all of our partner agencies. The grants process happens, it has been at various times once a year or twice a year, whereby we go out to grants and we have a large consultation process with the Constabulary and with local community safety partnerships about where that money goes to ensure that the money that the Commissioner is granting is actually properly targeted and integrated into local services. Very few services are standalone, working in a vacuum. All of our services work as a network of services and support each other and refer on to each other and provide a range of support which is complementary to each other. And so it is essential that when we look for solutions to the problems that we mentioned earlier, that they are seen very much within the context of the total range of services that are made available. And the next slide, please, Andrew. Right, the current contracts include the Victim Care Service, that's currently managed by Victim Support. We have a range of support victims to domestic abuse, or in partnership with our top tier local authorities. At the moment, we're doing a very specific piece of work on that with our partners, looking to reduce the complexity of access to services for domestic abuse and services for people who have experienced sexual crime, so that we have a more coherent, unified approach to accessing those services, which all parties are signed up to. Therapeutic counselling for young victims of sexual abuse, female genital mutilation and missing and exploited trafficked. We have support worker at the Sexual Abuse Referral Centre. Now that is interesting in terms of the role of the PCC. The SARC, as it's known in Cosham in Portsmouth, the SARC, when someone has been a victim of sexual abuse, they can go to the SARC, and what will happen there is they will be medically examined and they will be interviewed by the police. The medical examination is to gather evidence for prosecution. The interview by police is there again to gather evidence for prosecution. Our role there is to support the victim, is to make sure that the victim's needs are taken first, and to make sure that they are not overruled. And the police are there, who are there, are fantastic, as are the medical staff, but we need someone there who is simply there to make sure that the needs of the victim of crime are actually seen as paramount in that process. Working with perpetrators of domestic abuse, we have various contracts around doing that. We will not reduce domestic abuse by only working with victims. The government have just given us an additional amount of money to work with perpetrators of domestic abuse, and those are in contracts across all 4 areas. Restorative justice services, this was a very specific area of work which crosses both the reducing offending side, because people, the offenders who go through restorative justice have got a huge success rate in not reoffending, and also to give the victim a voice in the criminal justice system. So when people have been a victim of crime, where they wish to talk and understand and confront maybe to gain a greater understanding and to move on from that crime, then restorative justice services can be incredibly important and inspiring. And I have been incredibly inspired by many of the stories I've heard from our restorative justice services, which in Hampshire is under contract, managed by Restorative Services. And finally, integrated offender management. This is where we work with people who are coming out of the criminal justice system in partnership with many voluntary organisations, the police and the probation service. Okay, next slide, please, Andy. Right, we've been involved in many pilot partnership and national pilots at different times. We've looked through that. Some of these have been mentioned already. We've talked, I've mentioned about the rationalised access to services. We first started thinking about this as a single front door, but that would be to greatly oversimplify the way that we need to kind of look at access to domestic abuse and sexual crime services. Then we have as I mentioned earlier, the devolved funding for the sexual crime therapeutic support services from the MOJ. That has been hugely interesting in terms of how we integrate that funding and those services into the other sexual crime services that are funded by ourselves and our partners. We have the Violence Reduction Unit 342 Offenders Study, which is looking at the lives of the people who have been most likely to offend. The hate crime out of court disposal has already been mentioned. It is a very interesting piece of work which we're doing with Avon and Somerset and West Midlands, whereby not everyone who's a victim of hate crime wishes to take the offender through the whole court process. This is an alternative where people do not wish necessarily to do that. If there's been an incident in a town centre at night where there's been examples of hate crime, this is an alternative to the victim having to go through the whole court process where they do not wish to and otherwise would not. And then finally, we have the multi-agency stalking intervention programme. There are many others, but I just wanted to focus on these. That MASSIP was an interesting example of what James was mentioning earlier about only the Police and Crime Commissioner could do this. We have a thriving, wonderful service in Hampshire called the Stalking Clinic, which is a partnership between many agencies, including Aurora New Dawn. Again, our role is to fund the advocate for the victims. So with MASSIP, with the Stalking Clinic, because of the great work that had been going on with the Stalking Clinic, which is a multi-agency response to issues of stalking and making sure that people are supported out of it, the government recognised this by awarding a considerable amount of money. It's about 350,000 to 400,000 a year, I think, for something called MASSIP, which was jointly with Cheshire and MOPAC in London, which was MASSIP is the multi-agency stalking intervention project. sometimes also known as RICOLO, but that's just a confusion there. And MASIP brings together psychiatry, psychologists looking at working on the behaviour, and again we are working to support the victims. It's had huge success, and then the Home Office money ran out. The Police and Crime Commissioner, faced with the closure of this hugely successful service, the MASIP element that is, was able to intervene, work with health commissioners, and and for the last 2 years, funding has now continued from health and the probation service, and MASIP is continuing its excellent work. So that was an example where it's not a part of our spending, but it is a part of our overall management of the supply side of services. So, and the final slide, I believe, is a range of is just some of the logos of some of the people that we've been working with. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Alan. Huge impact from the work of the commissioning team, and just to finish on this slide in terms of the numbers of partners, and I put in the chat that the number of people that you engage as PCC to see success is critical, and Alan and the team, the work they do with, and this is just a small number of the partners. I'm going to go on and hand over to Laura now, who's head of communications and engagement, and looks at all the work we do with the public. Now, again, imagine, if you will, as Laura and I start our journey together, and we consider how we might contact 2 million people, how we might get involved in terms of sending out the good news of the work the Commission is doing. And our first discussion is how do we leaflet the numbers of houses that are associated with people who live in Hampshire. And Laura came back and said, James, I've had a quick quote. All I need is £300,000, and that will get you one short leaflet to all the houses once a year. Now, no was the answer. There's a lot you can do with £300,000. Certainly, working as a commissioner, you can commission years of services for something. And so what we do in terms of leaflets is we send out a council tax leaflet, which Laura will cover, but we managed to do that at 1/10 of the cost. So we do spend £30,000 a year, but we do get that vital information to every household across the whole of Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton and the Isle of Wight, and that is the very most cost-effective way to get written information. And so we do leverage social media, we do leverage the Constabulary's website, our website, we do leverage Hants Alert and as many other different media and ways to get messages out. But Laura, as far as I'm concerned, has one of the toughest jobs across the whole of the office, which is how to engage with the public, keep the public infused and interested, make sure she's engaging with all the key stakeholders and all of their needs and pressures. And as I said to you, if you just engage with one key stakeholder a day, you get to see them 3 times in your term, because there are 365, and actually that's a very conservative estimate. I think we're nearer 500 in terms of individuals that would be coming to you to want to speak to you personally on a regular basis as a commissioner. So, Laura, I'm going to hand over to you, if I may.
Thank you, James. Yes, so I will run through some of the detail that James has just kindly outlined. Just a little bit about my background. I've been working in the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner for the last 4 years. During that time, we've developed a highly successful team, and you'll hear about some of the channels and work that we've done to reach all of those stakeholders and public that James has just been talking about. Previous to that, I was 10 years as head of comms and marketing for Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. And before that, I come from a third sector background of national charities in London. So I've got quite a broad background as well. And we've got really broad ranging backgrounds of members of my team as well, which is really helpful to connecting with those stakeholder groups. You've heard this morning from James about the statutory duties to bring partners together to join up local priorities and to ensure effective engagement with communities. So that's what I focus my presentation on. There's a huge amount to run through, so I will try and run through as much as I can, and some of the reach that we achieve with those channels as well. But obviously, please do ask questions. As James was saying around the council tax leaflet, I will go into a bit more detail about that. But our focus really over the last 4 years it's been about building foundations and channels, and also we will set the objective to move from reaching hundreds of people to hundreds of thousands. So that will be the focus of my presentation. We're focused on reaching every person living, working and travelling in Hampshire. So we do have quite a huge task. So we do that through integrated communications, intelligence-led and targeted communication and marketing engagement activity. By integrated, I mean pulling together all the different channels that we've got, but not only our channels. The important thing is working with our partners, and which helps us to reach much larger audience, and they can act as our ambassadors as well. Intelligence-led, you've heard a lot about that from Anya today, but it's very much informing how we target and where we have crime stats in certain areas, helps to inform our work around crime prevention. So we like to base that in information and make sure that we are intelligence-led. And by targeted, obviously, there are key groups that we want to reach in different ways, and I will run through some of that. We do aim to use two-way platforms. That's really important to us because that's the engagement part of the work that we do. So we don't want to be seen just as information. When I go on to some of that detail around the council tax leaflet, that actually we will set measures within that, set up a specific URL code to come through to our website. We're able to see a 200% increase in people coming to the council tax page as a result of that, and that's really important for us to be able to see that the work that we're doing is reaching people and engaging them as well. So in terms of how we do that, what channels we have, we've got digital communications. I know some of you do follow us and comment on some of our posts, which is great. So we've got the website. Again, in terms of the website, we have 130,000 visits to our website year on year, and it's gone up year on year as well. Social media, in particular Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, that we have as our main channels, and our youth commission also use TikTok and Instagram. Obviously, getting young people to keep connected with the new channels that young people engage with is really important as well. Video content as well, that's something we've really focused on over the last 4 years, and we go out and film that video, so it's all done in-house, or we work with partners. And again, it's about partners selling a message and showing people where the value of the money. We've heard from Alan with the commissioning partners. It's really important that we see with them where that money's going and the impact it's having. Even if that's a handful of people, actually the quality of their life and the impact that's had on them as victims is a really important message. We also link up with the Hampshire Constabulary comms team on a regular basis, and we have Hants Alerts, which is one of the best tools to reaching thousands of people across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And neighbourhood policing teams, they've really focused, and Constabulary have really focused on developing their digital beat. That's something that we connect in with. I think there's more that we can do with that, and that's run by their neighbourhood policing teams. But then you've got the authentic voice of policing talking to their local communities, and it's a tool that we can use as well. We also develop marketing materials for the Commissioner in-house. So write, design and publish of the range of publications that are required. We've heard about the police and crime plan today, the annual reports. We tend to reduce any actual printing now. So when I say publish, we do put them online and make sure that we send those links out to people and have hard copies available should people want it. But you can do that in a much more cost-effective way by publishing online as opposed to printing. We've developed much more accessible materials as well. So we call them our plan on a page, but it helps to summarise a lot of quite detailed long documents. And that's really important to us as well, to be accessible to all the communities we serve. And our website has recently been through a lot of review and meets the accessibility requirements of new acts around that with websites. Attendance, we also attend a range of local and county events, and this allows the Commissioner to have face-to-face contact with a range of communities, and it also allows us to do the constant questioning around policing priorities and consultation we've heard other people talk about. We don't just wait till once a year. We actually have created just a consultation card that we can get people to complete what their top 3 priorities would be, and that's been a really helpful gauge and pulse check of our communities throughout the year, as opposed to waiting until the end of the year. This includes things like the county show, that New Forest County Show, Isle of Wight County Show, Alresford Show, all of those sorts of things, Hampshire Constabulary Roar of Action, but also very local events. We go to the Eastleigh Lights Switch On at Christmas, probably a much smaller footfall, but really good target audience for us to go out and talk to with our safer packs around, you know, our vulnerable people, victims of crime, and it's a really good audience for us there. So we run a range of those. And in the last 4 years, we've engaged with directly face-to-face with around 13,000 people at over 200 public events. Now, obviously, this year we've had to move more online, so I will talk a little bit more about that as well. In addition to those large events I mentioned about Eastleigh Lights Christmas Switch On, but we also do things like the Mela, Eastleigh Mela, Polish Day in Southampton, Pride events across the Hampshire and Isle of Wight as well. So again, being visible and accessible to more than 100,000 people from diverse communities over the last 4 years. In addition to those partner events, we also have created our own events to enable greater engagement and targeted engagement for areas that support the police and crime plan and our statutory duties to engage and consult. This has included over the years rural community, rural matters, engagement events and series of conferences. We run an annual Safer Together event, which we've run in large venues across Hampshire. We've done Portsmouth, Southampton and Basingstoke. And that's again about engaging our partners, and our partners to be the voice of police and crime commissioners, to showing the value of where the money is invested, and engaging with the public so those services are used and are of value and of benefit to them. That's been a really successful event. We have wide reach on the day, but also in the lead up to and afterwards. This year we've had a particular success with Safer, which we deemed Safer Together Apart. Obviously we started out the year with a full programme of face-to-face events, which we had to quickly change. We actually moved all of that online to a 4-week period where we did a lot of connecting in with our partners, Hampshire Constabulary, a lot of messaging around crime prevention, around fraud, scams, so people's homes, and if they're out and about, so fraud and scams, online cyber safety, domestic abuse, hate crime and crime prevention. It's hugely successful, enabled us to reach into people who were a much larger number of people who had moved online, and we achieved a sort of over 2 million potential social media impressions, over 150,000 people reached on social media, over 3,000 engagements as well. So really good opportunity, and I think what that shows us as well going forwards for a future commissioner is a really good balance of doing online work and that face-to-face, and striking that balance of still what are the important groups and who do you want to see and who do you want to hear from. We are focused on helping the commissioner to be visible, accessible and accountable to the public, partner and stakeholders, and the more engagements of the commissioner, the more content that we can have and is created that we can then share through all of these channels. And all of this is shaped into a 12-month delivery plan for us, which outlines the theme and focus for that quarter, and also we do monthly plan on a page to show who we're targeting, who we're engaging with, and includes seasonal issues. Our statutory duties are outlined within there as well, and it outlines how we can engage our wide audiences. So into the slide that you can currently see shows just, obviously I don't expect you to see all of the detail there, but just shows you the intelligence that goes behind a lot of the work and the targeting and the engagement that we do, so that we can measure and importantly not only measure but that we can adapt what we do. So we can look at where we're reaching particular audiences, our reach on social media, if it's going up or down or doing particularly well, why is that, how can we do that again, our traditional media reach, our events reach, and what we've also done is we've become more sophisticated even in our events reach. So we also have set up a matrix to enable us to look at influencers, so our higher profile stakeholders, and if they are sharing content for us on social media, it helps to show that our reach is widening, and also that's been a useful tool for us to engage with as well. We prepared this report quarterly, but we also do a monthly report as well, which you can see on the left-hand side. There's been a significant scale of change over the last 4 years, and as I said earlier, we've really focused on reaching volume. What's been really important with reaching the hundreds of thousands is also making sure that we have that engagement as well. We post a lot of content through our social media channels. This year, we stepped in this space. We've been working with our partners in Local Resilience Forum and made sure that we're sharing messages and partner messaging, and also our own messaging around coronavirus. It's dominated a lot of our content this year as well, which was not something we necessarily planned in, but we adapted obviously in terms of what was on the news agenda, so that the PCC could have a voice in this area. And that has been our coronavirus pages on the website have reached over 50,000 people as well. So it clearly is about adapting what we do and making sure that the Commissioner has a role and a voice and a profile within the news agenda. And this all builds really strong foundations on which the next PCC can build. Could I have the next slide, please, Andy? You'll see from some of these stats, I won't go into all of the detail, you've seen some of the dashboards behind it, but just gives you a bit of a flavour of our total news reach. So the opportunity to see over the last, since September 2017, 112 million. Our news value, it's a crude way of measuring, but everybody does use that way of measuring. If that was achieved or paid for advertising, this is how much actually would have cost. Actually, of course, editorial is much more important to us, but that gives a value as to sort of number of reach as well. You'll see in the small pie chart there, just gives it a flavour of majority of our work is proactive and organic, and the smaller section, the white there, is about how we react to our press inquiries as well. And just the posts there, the Twitter posts and the Facebook posts, just give you a bit of an indication of some of our most recent posts and the reach through that in terms of how many people we're reaching and the actual engagement through that as well. I've already mentioned about the website and how we are growing year on year with the website. And our social media channels, I think we continue to grow those. And as I said earlier, really Hants alerts and linking up with the Hampshire Constabulary is really important reach through our social media as well. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Andy? You've heard this morning from James around the number of stakeholders we have. I think he's right, there probably is more than 365, and it's growing. And I've outlined on this table some of the groupings of our key stakeholders, which were a focus of our work, and how we reach those stakeholder groups as well as our public. In 2020, for example, we held nearly 70 virtual events online, which increased the reach to our stakeholder groups. And they wouldn't normally find time for face-to-face engagement with us and attending some of our events. So again, that's something going forward. I think that's really important to us. I've mentioned about Local Resilience Forum. We've connected up with them really strongly in the last year. And again, there's a range of partners as part of that. Hampshire Constabulary and all of the first category 1 responders. So that's enabled us to have a voice within that environment, and also making sure that we're sharing partner messages and them sharing our messaging. Local Criminal Justice Board, again, in the last couple of years, we are now established with our support. You've heard from Enzo about particulars around that relationship, but also we now have a specific objective within their business plan around public confidence and engagement, and that gives again the PCC a voice in that criminal justice arena. We send out regular stakeholder updates to MPs, top tier leaders, police and crime panel members, and that is written from the Commissioner to send out on a regular basis. We don't set those necessarily monthly, you send those as and when they're required. We've also created annual Safer Awards, which again engage our public and stakeholder groups. We ran our one again this year online, enabled us connecting with a lot of community safety leads, voices from our community, and Policing Minister attended and was very supportive of that event this year. So I think that the range that we have there, we have policing and all of the underpinning stakeholder groups within that. That's obviously a really important stakeholder group for the Commissioner. We connect in and put messaging onto their channels on a regular basis, and obviously the Commissioner himself currently liaises directly with the Chief Constable and the Chief Officers Group. National political groups, from a communications perspective, we link up with the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners Communication Network, and we regularly create content for their in focus PCCs, which are shared nationally and with government, and also share our best practice with other partners as well. The formal partnerships, I think that's an indication of a list. I think there are many more even than what we have on there. All of the different boards that we're represented on. We've heard a lot of that from Alan this morning in terms of our community safety partnerships, our commission partners. The slide you've just seen that Alan finished with, that gives an indication of all of those different partners that are important stakeholder groups for us, for that two-way flow of communication, and also to be ambassadors for the Commissioner and the investment and the support of victims. And then we have our community stakeholder groups as well. We regularly engage with the High Sheriff, mayors, Lord Lieutenants, faith leaders, community leaders. We've got some organic work with our community and faith leaders at the moment, particularly around equality and inclusion, and there's a lot of work going on to widen our reach and connections and engagement with those audiences. Neighbourhood Watch, we've heard from Anya about our universities, colleges and schools. We connect in with them through some of our youth engagement work, which I'll outline as well, and then our third sector partners. So there's a huge amount going on there, and a huge number of people that we engage with and communicate with on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So really this is an outline of the statutory duty we have. We've heard from James this morning around this in terms of gaining the views of our community. As I've mentioned, our main large consultation event that we undertake every year is around our budget consultation. We're currently undertaking that consultation at the moment. We present the findings of that survey as part of the Commissioner's recommendations to the Police and Crime Panel later this month. We're already reaching 5,000 people on our online survey. We did 2,500 before Christmas. To add to that number, we also use YouGov as a tool to reach a representative sample, and we are doing focus groups later this week as well. So we are one of the best and highest number of people we reach of PCCs in the country outside of London with our reach for our budget consultation. And I mentioned earlier about we don't just leave it until the end of the year. We do also ask people throughout the year, whether that's online or whether that's face-to-face, as to whether they'd support extra money for policing, but also to support the vulnerable and victims, and where they see their priorities, where they'd like to see priorities supported. We also have created an OPCC focus and consultation group, which Anya's team created that group to enable face-to-face communication, which has over 400 people that have self-selected to be onto that consultation group. And also our Youth Commission members, which I will go into a little bit more detail about, they represent the voice of young people on policing and community matters. And we run what we call a big conversation consultation with them on an annual basis. Since 2015, we've reached nearly 12,000 young people, and year on year they identify priorities that are important to them and represent the voice of policing and young people on a range of boards, and are very influential. Their influence and reach has hugely grown over the last few years. And during the pandemic, we worked with Hampshire Constabulary to go out and ask the public around their confidence in policing, and if policing were getting it right during the pandemic. And we reached over 45,000. We had over 45,000 completed responses for that survey. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of the leaflet that we've talked about that goes out with the council tax bills. This is actually again engaged with all local authorities to enable this to happen, and enables us to get into every household within Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, provides important information for the local residents to know where their council tax is being invested, and provides a breakdown of that funding, and also what policing is doing, gives a bit of an idea of a day in the life of the police force, where that money is being invested. And as I said earlier, that does enable us to see that people are then actually coming to our website and engaging with us once they have read that council tax leaflet. It also has some details on the back there that creates a directory and signposting to some of the services that are available, which again is another really important part of our engagement activity. Next slide, please, Andy. So we've spoken about our youth commission. We've actually moved, again, our strategy has really moved from, we had the youth commission, which were a highly effective group of young people engaging with young people and giving a view to the Commissioner and the Chief Constable on policing priorities. We've actually really sort of stepped up our strategy around youth engagement, and in addition to our youth commission, we also have a cyber ambassador scheme, which I'm going to mention in a moment. We've developed a really strong relationship with student union leads, which enables us to actually reach an older young person's audience and connecting on a range of work. And we're looking to run campaigns with them going forwards. We also keep our young voice is represented with the Violence Reduction Unit and the work there, which we've heard about earlier today. And we are just currently looking to develop a strategic youth independent advisory group. So the Constabulary currently have their independent advisory group, but it's not particularly accessible to young people. And actually working with the Constabulary, that's been handed over to us to actually develop on their behalf to allow scrutiny from young people. So it's a really, really good opportunity for us to even increase the influence and voice of young people further. I've already mentioned around the work of the Youth Commission. They consult and they represent the Commissioner on a number of boards that you can see there on the slide. We do the big conversation every year, and they identify their priorities, which is where work is focused, currently on exploitation, hate crime and serious violence. That's all taken, those priorities and those campaigns and that work is all taken from the big conversation, what young people are telling us is important. James mentioned about Raise a Flag campaign last year or 2 years ago now, which had total reach of over 1 million people. It actually won Chartered Institute of Public Relations Gold Awards for the campaign. And so showed the influence to actually have that impact within a professional group of people as against business, third sector and other public sector. Just on to the final slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So this is another huge success that's come from our Youth Commission, which started out as a concern that was raised through the big conversation around young people having concerns around cyber safety. We started a campaign back in 2016 called Go Fish, so Go Find Internet Safety Help, which then followed and developed into Cyber Ambassador Scheme. We have 2 of our young Youth Commission members that are now employed to run the Cyber Ambassador schemes in primary and secondary schools. It's a unique in its offering. It's a peer-to-peer support program where our 2 members of staff go into schools, or they're doing that remotely now, and create a network of cyber ambassadors, young people that are then looking out for the cyber safety and train their peers and their friends in cyber safety. So far, we've reached more than 25,000 pupils to enable them to be safer online. And during the pandemic, we've actually increased our offering online and opened up that to schools that weren't registered and to parents to enable greater safety online, as we found that more young people were online during this time. That's my quick run through of everything. I'm sorry, I know I talked very quickly about what we're doing. There's a lot to cover, and I'm sure you've got some questions. I saw some things pinging in, but I'll have a look at those.
So I'll just round up at the end. So you have as a PCC, you have a statutory responsibility to exercise duties in relation to safeguarding children and the promotion of child welfare. And one of the areas that we absolutely know that we've discovered, that we've analysed, that we've had requests for, is this area of safer online. And so the work that the Youth Commission have done, and now with this it's got national acclaim, the Cyber Ambassador scheme that's run in Hampshire. Not only does it have national acclaim, it's supported by Amazon and Cisco, 2 people you may be very aware of within the international online community and companies of huge strategic importance. And they're supporting us in the delivery and rollout of cyber ambassadors. There are over 325,000 students across the whole of the Hampshire area. And I'm delighted that in the first instance, we've reached 25,000. And on that basis, that was working into primary schools only. We've now set up and are running this year our work into secondary schools, and then further extending. Our plans are to take it into the 6th form colleges. But it's absolutely essential, this work that's being done, that's caring for these young people in a way in which they understand this online environment that I suggest that most of us currently in this online room came to from a different world and are many of us adept at using online functions, but haven't grown up in an online world. And so caring for children in an online world is absolutely essential to our ability to promote child welfare. And for us, this is one of the most exciting things we do. It's homegrown. It's something that's got international acclaim in terms of the companies that are supporting us to deliver it. And it's making a difference. And we would continue to offer this as a solution for you as PCC, to use this to meet the young people, to get into the schools, to talk to them about how to keep safer online, but also to work with these people who then become in many ways your next electors as they go up into 6th form and on into university. So other questions that we've got here, lots of youth engagement. Enzo, we did have a number of questions about equality and inclusion and diversity, and I very much thought it'd be good just to, before I go into what does the PCC do with policing, perhaps we just spend a few minutes just unpacking that together, because whilst we hadn't planned to cover it today, the PCC does a huge amount with the diverse communities, and Enzo and I lead different parts of it. I'll hand over to Enzo first, and he can unpack the work that we've been doing with some of the very specific communities since last year, particularly in the event of Black Lives Matter, and then where some of those strands have gone.
Yeah, of course, no problem, James. So in terms of the way we approached this, is that we drew together a lot of the different strands of work that was already ongoing to create a kind of single approach to equality, diversity and inclusion issues that crossed into the work of the Constabulary, but also crossed into the work of our office as an OPCC, and then into the relationship we have with the partners that you've heard of across the other presentations. So in essence, we pulled together for Michael a kind of 5-point action plan that dealt with different issues around equality and diversity, and as James mentioned, captured all the issues that the Black Lives Matter campaign in the summer had risen back to the top of people's agenda. So if I just refer to the 5 points, so you can get an idea of the nature of the work that we're doing, and then I'll hand over to James so he can talk about the specifics he's doing around Gypsy and Traveller, and then I'll pick up the rest of the work. So there's the high level scrutiny of the Constabulary, which is kind of point one. And this is all around the territory of how a commissioner and the chief constable engage, and how a commissioner holds the chief constable to account to ensure that their force is representative of the communities that they police, and also that the Constabulary is policing by consent, because that's a key part of the relationship between the public and the police. That we allow the police to police us, and that's a really key part of the consent aspect. And if communities don't feel that there's that issue of consent, then that's when you see some of the rage that you saw across the country about they're not my police. And this is part of the work that a commissioner does to ensure that there's that trust and belief in the policing system, so that all people that live in the force area have the trust and belief in their constabulary. So you've got that high level scrutiny, and one example of what that is the engagement that the commissioner has with the chief and the compass meetings that we've already talked about. And I think the one in November focused directly on equality and diversity. And if I recall, I think there were a couple of questions in the last one in December from the public around the treatment of individuals from different communities in terms of how crimes are investigated. The second aspect of our 5-point plan is a full review of the current stop and search scrutiny processes undertaken by the Constabulary. So I'll give you an example of what we're doing here. So the current format of scrutiny for the Constabulary, we have our work that Anya and her team undertake, but we were looking at doing something that had a more public engagement, more grassroots. So effectively people that experience policing can tell policing how they're operating. And we're very fortunate to have Jason Kenny as part of our team, because he's been instrumental in helping us develop this, and also being very open to the challenge that we've put to him and the team about how can you make your stop and search scrutiny much more transparent, and also how do you enable a feedback loop. So there's no point us scrutinising or the public telling you how to change if you then don't change as a constabulary. So that's a key part of what we're looking to do in terms of reviewing the way stop and search are undertaken. So another aspect of that is how we look at body-worn video that an officer uses when they do that engagement with the public. And we're establishing a regime whereby the OPCC, the office panel within the office, scrutinise the way that those body-worn video interactions happen, and then create again the feedback loop for change. I'll go back to mention about how we're getting more public interaction in the way that the police and the public interact. We're looking to establish your view panels. We're calling them your view panels because we're drawing the public to give us your view about policing. And we've held 3 pilot sites across some of the northern districts. And the evaluation of those has been very positive. And the next conversation is how do we create a rolling programme of those your view panels across the whole of the force area. The other part, the third part of the plan is into the Constabulary's current training on diversity and inclusion. And this is also around how the Constabulary are recruiting a broader range of individuals into their force. So a significant part of the work that is delivering the extra 20,000 officers and our share of those 20,000 officers is to ensure that we recruit from a broader pool of people. And we hold the Constabulary to account, Michael holds the Constabulary to account in terms of how they're doing that and whether they're meeting the demand that the intake of officers meets and exceeds the representative portion of Black, ethnic, Asian, Chinese within Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. The other aspect of that is ensuring that there's the right type of education and training for officers so that they're fully aware of the diverse nature of the communities they police, and also they become culturally competent in how those communities operate so they can be more effective police, and also they create that connection and trust between those communities. The fourth part is around engagement. How do we improve our engagement with communities and community leaders and key influencers? And this is all around the work that Laura mentioned about how do we, as an organisation, support the Constabulary in how they reach out, but also how we give a different voice to people so they can raise concerns and ideas with us. So there's a network of community cohesion officers across the force area, and we work closely with them because they're the bridge into communities. But we're always looking for different ways to engage with people that may not traditionally engage with us. So that's the fourth aspect of the plan that we're doing. And the fifth part is looking at ourselves, looking at the Commissioner's office. What are we doing? Are we doing things in the right way? So, you know, are our commission services reaching out to those communities? Are the way we tailor our contracts supporting equality and diversity? Are the organisations that work with us espousing the values that we believe are right? Because if, you know, they're not, then should they change, and should we be working with different people? And we've also just started a rolling programme of equality, diversity and inclusion training for all our members of staff. So again, we develop a sense of cultural competence so that we can feel that we know how to engage with diverse communities, because it's important that, you know, us as an office relate to everyone who lives in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. James, that's our 5-point plan. Do you want to pick up your aspects of this in terms of the
I'll
travellers?
a little. I highlighted right back at the beginning of the morning, you may remember that there are over 90 different communities represented across Portsmouth, Southampton, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And so there's a considerable amount of work that needs to be done, and Enzo's highlighted the work that's being done to make sure that policing is seen as being legitimate amongst those communities, because no matter who you are, you need to be able to see policing as being your policing that's for you to keep you safe. Now, when we started looking at Black Lives Matter and making sure that our black communities felt that, and because there was a very real question and a challenge, and as Enzo said, not my police force. There's another community grouping in Hampshire and Come to Hampshire that perhaps you'll be familiar with, but you won't like, and that's the Gypsy and Traveller community. Potentially even the last bastion of acceptable racism in terms of what we would call a gypsy or a traveller, and the community's response to them in the way in which they present within their community, which I like you. I hope you would find this offensive, but they nonetheless represent a real challenge to us, because when they do want to find their way into our community and they do want to travel, and often they are Hampshire people who live statically for part of the year but travel for part of the year, they want places to stop because it's their lifestyle, it's their community, it's the way they live their lives. But the way in which that manifests means that we find it really difficult, that they get themselves in trouble with policing, or they find that they're disrupting a community in a way that causes very real concern for people's safety. Not least of which it costs a significant amount of money in terms of either council intervention or policing intervention. And yet these people are families, they're children who need educating, there are ladies who are pregnant, they need better healthcare. The Gypsy community has a lower life expectancy than many of the other communities that represent across Hampshire. And so what the Commissioner is doing is choosing to bring back to life something that had disappeared a couple of years ago, which is a cross Hampshire working group that seeks to drive consistency into the policy and into the support of this community, to try to seek better outcomes for the community, but also to reduce the cost on the public purse. And we believe that there's a possibility to do both, but it takes concerted effort. It takes real thought, and it takes commitment from all of the different public service organisations. And so one of the things that we know about being the Police and Crime Commissioner is there are some things that only the Police and Crime Commissioner can do. The Police and Crime Commissioner has a responsibility to this community, but doesn't have a grouping of people that have a vested interest in the community and the impact that gypsy travellers have on the community, and so can hold the ring and draw interested parties together, both councillors and officers. And that's what we're choosing to do, to try and find a better way for Hampshire. So we're engaging with a number of different service providers, from Friends and Families to Leedsgate to Cushty Bok, all who are different charity partners across the country who would want to see better outcomes for gypsies, but not just better outcomes for gypsies, better outcomes for the communities in which gypsies find themselves. And so that's part of the work that we're doing, because it's essential that the Commissioner take a view that he care for all of the different communities, all of the different lifestyles and choices that people make. When they're lawful. When they're unlawful, then the Commissioner takes a different view and works with policing. But nonetheless, if we can get better outcomes, if we could get negotiated stopping, if we could get the councils to take their responsibility to provide gypsy and traveller accommodation assessments and provide the accommodation that those assessments identify, that then we would see better outcomes, less impact from travelling families pitching up at the side of the road or on land that's not theirs. And so we do it because we want to reduce the cost to policing, but we also want to see better outcomes. And the Commissioner's in a good position to be able to work with all of the different public services to do it. And so we take our role in terms of the work with these communities, diversity, inclusion and equality across all of the different protected characteristics. And that's really key, that those protected characteristics do form part of the underlying principles in which we use to define the work that we do. So I hope you found that interesting, just in terms of a little bit of an insight. There's much more we could say, but we'll seek to make sure we make some of this information, just in terms of some of the presentations we've done to others, some of the work. I mean, all the work that we're doing with gypsies and travellers is publicly available. I mean, it's a new initiative for us over the last couple of months. We're about to publish a report to that panel, which on behalf of the Commissioner, which we'd be very pleased to share with you. So we'll try and make some of that available. So I'm just going to run into my closing for us, if that's okay. So you as the Commissioner, so I'm going to take you beyond the election. I'm going to ask you to imagine you've been successful. Your challenge is to manage public expectation. Now, whether you know it or not, I'm going to introduce you to something called a high harm model. Now, what it is that Hampshire, as we set out right at the beginning, is funded well, but actually is underfunded by £42 million a year. So yes, we've been given some more money. Yes, we're recruiting more officers. Yes, we had 156 last year. We've got 146 this year. We'll have another 146 next year. Yes, the government are supporting that. But do you know that that's into the ones and 2 million? So we get an extra 4 million for those officers. 42 million would buy 10 times as many police officers. Can you imagine the difference that would make? And so if policing needs that many, because that's how it was set out, and the policing model has changed to accommodate not having that money in the system, it means that it's having to respond through a model to different types of crime. And the Chief Constable and the Deputy are going to go into much more detail this afternoon, but I just want to highlight this for you, because that little circle there, public expectation of visible policing balanced with the need to tackle more hidden crime at its root, is what we're talking about. So policing uses a model called a Thor model: threat, harm, opportunity and risk. And all of those things are weighed up to define how policing responds to crime. Now, I'm not a policing specialist. I'm here to support the Police and Crime Commissioner in the very broadest spectrum of what they do. And that's why we have the Jace, who supports us in terms of interpreting the policing model and way policing is delivering for us to help us shape what the Police and Crime Commissioner does. And that's going to be good going forward. We introduced Jace to you because Jace will be part of the team as you join us as Police and Crime Commissioner. So who's in charge of policing and how does it work? We've got this is a public accessible leaflet. This is available. I'm just going to drop you through this a bit at a time. So you're the Police and Crime Commissioner. You've been elected. The public have said, please, Commissioner, understand our needs and our wants. And again, I raise that to you because the two are very different. What the public want in terms of visible policing is very different, perhaps, to what the public need in terms of what's made available to keep them safe, and the effectiveness of the two, and the money that you have not only to direct to policing, but the money that you have to direct beyond policing, we've spoken about, your responsibility to prevent crime, which is different to the Chief Constable's responsibility to direct crime, your responsibility to support the vulnerable, your responsibility to support victims, your responsibility to support young people, your responsibility to care for older people as they are more vulnerable in terms of the changing nature of crime. All of that is a tension in which you write your plan, you listen to the community safety partnerships, you listen to the top tier authorities, you listen to further other key stakeholders, and you translate all of that into action. And again, that's your role and our role as the office. As again, I outlined for you that this is a job that's bigger than one person, and to cover all of that means, as you set the strategy, as you look at an efficient and effective police force, setting the budget setting mentioned earlier in the day starts in September, but public consultation goes on through the year. The modelling of what can be afforded and what can't be afforded, the Chief Constable making representations, and the Chief Constable bid this year for a minimum of £20 million a year extra on top of her budget to be able to support the new officers coming in, because it's fine that you get extra money from the government to employ officers, but you need more than police officers. Police officers need to be equipped, they need to be supported, they need to be enabled, they need to be able to be brought to the street effective, they need to be mentored. All of this is an extra cost on top of the cost of employing police officers, and so there has to be a both and so it's your choice as to what you do with the council tax, because that's the only flexibility you have above the policing grant. And this year the policing grant had no extra money. Just so you understand that. It had additional money for uplift, so that's the directed solely to the additional police officers, but no other additional money. So the bills have all gone up. The inflation, whilst it is low, the cost to run a police force and crime has changed. It continues to be more challenging. Policing needs to be equipped to respond to the changing nature of crime, and the Chief Constable will talk more about that this afternoon. And I'll be honest, what she says is compelling. So therein lies your challenge. You own all the assets. So is that no extra at all, or no extra in real terms? That's no extra at all. Zero increase on the police grant this year. So that's very clear and quite stark. I'm not allowed. I'm specifically banned from being political, so I will stop at this point, because otherwise I may get myself in trouble. So yeah, I'll leave you to interpret from your own perspectives as you go to the public to talk to them about the challenges of that. So we hold the Chief Constable to account. You commission all of these services and you contribute to the national discussion about how to deliver policing here in Hampshire. But I would encourage you, it isn't a Hampshire only role. You have the opportunity to speak nationally, and Hampshire OPCC and Hampshire PCC is one of the leading contributors to what goes on in policing in this nation. And you aspire to join one of the most effective and highest performing teams and to lead us. And we are absolutely looking forward and relish the opportunity to work with whichever one of you is successful in the elections. So public PCCs are elected to be the voice of the people and deliver efficient and effective policing in the police force in their area. Pause. They're equally responsible for the budget and the performance of the force, including cutting crime, preventing crime, and seeing make a difference for those who are vulnerable and the children in your community. I believe there's a tension between those two statements, and making sure that the public are safe and making sure the public get what they need is something that you will wrestle with for 3 years, and you will find that comes to you a challenge every day. The government also, key part to play. National Policing Board recently set up. Here are the people that form the National Policing Board and are currently discussing and setting the direction for policing across the country. These are really important people. You will have the opportunity to be in contact with them, to influence them, to talk to them. You will be part of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. That does take up some of your time. You have the opportunity through the chief to influence the National Police Chiefs Council. That will take up some of your time. You will have the opportunity to work with a number of these people. Again, it takes up your time, but it's critical to make sure that the government are setting the direction appropriately for policing. HMIC, you are responsible for policing. You have the benefit of the HMIC and its HMIC FRS, so Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services. Now, we're rated good across the board. Fantastic. What a great place to be. The lowest funded force, top 5 in terms of scale after the Metropolitan Forces, and good across the board. Imagine how difficult it is to ask for any more money when the HMIC turn around and say, well, you're delivering very well, thank you very much. And so again, the challenge to ask for more money when other forces simply spend the money or don't perform well, therein lies the challenge. And for you as PCC, absolutely essential that you are seen to be influencing, speaking with the policing minister. Now, what an opportunity. Kit Malthouse, a local MP, Minister for Crime and Police. What a opportunity you have to work with one of your local MPs seeing national change. And we would encourage you to, no matter what party you represent or where you come from, it's critical to be speaking with the policing minister, and an opportunity to do that locally really helps, and it makes a difference for the people of Hampshire. Police and Crime Panel, one of you has asked to get a better briefing from them. A fantastic group of people to work with, bringing the views of the public, scrutinising you as the PCC. Now, their job is to scrutinise and support. You may have been to a Police and Crime Panel meeting. You may find that they scrutinise an awful lot more than they support. They do sometimes forget, and it's our job to continue to encourage and remind them that they, whilst challenging the PCC in terms of what the PCC does, it's really helpful when they up a gear and support the PCC in delivering better outcomes. So we do our very best, and we have a good, close and personal working relationship with every member of that, particularly Dave Stewart, who's the chair, and also with Jan, who's the vice chair. Fantastic people who really want to see the best for policing, but it's important that they exercise their role in scrutiny, but we do ask them to try to work hard to support us as well. So who else is responsible? Here is Olivia Pinkney. Olivia has been with us now she arrived just before the start of the term of this current Police and Crime Commissioner, has been doing an outstanding job, is one of the most highly regarded chief constables in the country. And as I said to you, she's now responsible for local policing as her portfolio for the country. She does an outstanding job. However, she faces that challenge of continuing to deliver effective policing. She is a corporation soul. She is the one responsible for delivery of effective policing. Your job is to scrutinise that, and we help you do that to make sure that she's making the right decisions and delivering the right outcomes. Now, sometimes there's a tension between what the public want and what the public need, and I've stressed this a number of times. This is why you spend a lot of time talking to the Chief Constable, because between you need to iron out the wrinkles between what Olivia can deliver and what the public are saying to you as Police and Crime Commissioner that they would like. And the messaging that sits around that is absolutely essential. Thank you all for your support today. It's been fantastic to be all. I don't like it being a virtual room. I very much want to meet you each in person, shake your hand, and thank you for considering standing to be Police and Crime Commissioner. From my perspective as your Chief Executive, I am looking forward to working with you, supporting you, bringing the excellence of the team that we have here in Hampshire to making your term as Police and Crime Commissioner the best yet. And so we are headed towards the 6th of May. We are planning for the 6th of May. However, should we be alerted to the fact, and I've recently been told that canvassing is not a lawful activity whilst we're in lockdown, what a challenge. I think that may be the most significant challenge to all the elections. I trust you've enjoyed your time with us today.